Welcome to the Discourse Analyzer AI Toolkit, where articles come alive. You're listening to the audio version of our article. For the full text and an interactive experience, check out the link in the description below. Interact with any selection using our AI assistant to enhance your understanding. Let's explore.
Inclusive language in discourse analysis. Interactive assistant inclusive language refers to language that is intentionally used to avoid excluding or marginalizing individuals or groups based on characteristics such as gender, race, ethnicity, disability, sexual orientation, or social status. In discourse analysis, inclusive language is studied to understand how language choices reflect and shape social relations, promote equality, and challenge existing power structures. Inclusive language aims to foster belonging and respect by acknowledging diversity and avoiding stereotypes or biased expressions. Discourse analysis of inclusive language explores how linguistic choices either reinforce or challenge dominant ideologies, how different social groups are represented in communication, and how language can either include or exclude certain voices. By analyzing inclusive language in political speeches, media, corporate communication, and everyday interactions, discourse analysts reveal the ways in which language reflects broader societal values and the ongoing effort to create more equitable discourses. Key features of inclusive language in discourse analysis. 1. Gender-neutral and non-binary language. One important feature of inclusive language is the use of gender-neutral or non-binary terms to avoid assuming or reinforcing binary gender distinctions. Discourse analysis examines how language is adapted to reflect the identities and experiences of people who do not fit within traditional gender norms. Example: in professional settings, using they, them pronouns or gender-neutral titles like chairperson instead of chairman ensures that language does not exclude non-binary or gender-diverse individuals. Discourse analysis would explore how these linguistic shifts reflect broader societal changes toward recognizing gender diversity and resisting traditional gender hierarchies. 2. Avoidance of racist or ethnic stereotypes. Inclusive language aims to avoid perpetuating racial or ethnic stereotypes by using respectful and accurate terminology when referring to racial or ethnic groups. Discourse analysis investigates how language choices either reinforce or challenge racial inequality and social justice. Example: the shift from using illegal immigrant to undocumented immigrant reflects an effort to avoid dehumanizing language and focus on the legal status rather than criminalizing a person's identity. Discourse analysis would explore how this linguistic change influences public perceptions of immigration and reflects an effort to frame the debate in more humane and inclusive terms. 3. Person-first language. In contexts related to disability, inclusive language often involves person-first language, which emphasizes the individual rather than defining them solely by their condition. Discourse analysis looks at how this language promotes dignity and challenges ableist attitudes. Example: instead of saying disabled person, person-first language would use person with a disability. Discourse analysis would explore how this shift in language reflects a more respectful approach to disability, emphasizing the person rather than the condition and challenging stereotypes about disability. 4. Representation of marginalized groups. Inclusive language involves ensuring that marginalized groups are represented fairly and respectfully in public discourse. Discourse analysis examines how language choices either amplify or silence marginalized voices and how inclusive language efforts work to make these groups more visible and respected. Example: media coverage that uses inclusive terms like indigenous peoples instead of tribes ensures that the complexity and sovereignty of indigenous groups are respected. Discourse analysis would explore how this shift reflects a growing awareness of historical injustices and the importance of using language that respects indigenous identities and rights. 5. Avoidance of sexist language. Sexist language includes words or expressions that reinforce traditional gender roles or assumptions about the capabilities or roles of men and women. Inclusive language challenges these assumptions by using gender-neutral or equitable terms. Example: shifting from terms like mankind to humankind removes the implicit gender bias and promotes a more inclusive view of humanity. Discourse analysis would examine how such linguistic changes challenge entrenched gender biases and promote a more equitable representation of both men and women. 6. Addressing implicit bias and microaggressions. Inclusive language also addresses the implicit biases and microaggressions that can exist in everyday speech, often without malicious intent. Discourse analysis investigates how subtle language choices can reinforce exclusion or discrimination, even when they appear neutral. Example: asking, "Where are you really from?" can imply that a person of color does not belong, even if they are a citizen. Discourse analysis would explore how such questions reflect unconscious biases and how efforts to educate people about microaggressions promote more inclusive and sensitive communication. 7. Intersectionality and inclusive language. Inclusive language also considers intersectionality, acknowledging how different aspects of identity, e.g., race, gender, sexuality, disability, intersect and shape individual experiences. Discourse analysis examines how language reflects or neglects this complexity and how it can be adapted to be more inclusive. Example: in discussions about gender equality, inclusive language would avoid assuming all women experience sexism in the same way, recognizing the additional barriers faced by women of color, LGBTQ+ women, or women with disabilities. Discourse analysis would explore how language reflects these intersectional identities and whether it challenges or reinforces inequalities. Methods for analyzing inclusive language in discourse. 1. Critical discourse analysis, CDA. Critical discourse analysis, CDA, investigates how inclusive language reflects or challenges power relations and ideologies. CDA focuses on how inclusive or exclusive language shapes social relations and either reinforces or contests systems of domination or oppression. Example: a CDA of corporate diversity policies might analyze how terms like diversity and inclusion are used to promote equity, while also investigating whether the language reflects genuine institutional change or functions more as symbolic branding. The analysis would explore how inclusive language intersects with organizational power dynamics. 2. Frame analysis. Frame analysis looks at how inclusive or exclusive language frames social issues and identities. This method examines how different language choices emphasize certain perspectives and shape public understanding. Example: in debates about transgender rights, framing might shift from transgender bathroom issues to access to public spaces for all, reflecting a more inclusive framing. Frame analysis would explore how this linguistic shift promotes inclusivity by framing the issue as one of universal access rather than a specific challenge for one group. 3. Rhetorical analysis. Rhetorical analysis examines how inclusive language is used to persuade or educate audiences about the need for equity and respect. This method focuses on how speakers appeal to ethos, credibility, pathos, emotion, and logos, logic, to promote inclusive language. Example: a public speaker might use ethos by referencing research on the benefits of inclusive language, pathos by invoking stories of individuals who have been marginalized by exclusive language, and logos by presenting logical arguments for inclusive practices. Rhetorical analysis would explore how these strategies work together to persuade audiences of the value of inclusive language. 4. Pragmatic analysis. Pragmatic analysis looks at how language functions in specific contexts, examining how inclusive or exclusive language choices affect social interactions. This method explores how people use language to navigate social norms, power dynamics, and cultural expectations. Example: in workplaces, the shift to using parental leave instead of maternity leave reflects a broader recognition of non-traditional family structures. Pragmatic analysis would investigate how this change affects workplace policies and social dynamics, promoting inclusivity for all parents regardless of gender. Examples of inclusive language in discourse analysis. Example 1. Corporate diversity statements. Many corporations release diversity and inclusion statements using phrases like, "We value diversity and are committed to fostering an inclusive environment for all employees." Discourse analysis would explore whether this language reflects genuine efforts toward inclusivity or functions as performative, symbolic language that does not result in meaningful institutional change. Example 2. Media representation of LGBTQ+ individuals. In media, using inclusive language such as partner instead of husband or wife, respects non-heteronormative relationships. Discourse analysis would investigate how this language challenges traditional gender norms and promotes a more inclusive representation of LGBTQ+ individuals. Example 3. Political discourse on immigration. In political debates, shifting from terms like illegal alien to undocumented immigrant reflects an effort to humanize the subject and avoid dehumanizing or criminalizing language. Discourse analysis would examine how this shift in language influences public attitudes toward immigration and frames the debate in more compassionate terms. Example 4. Inclusive education policies. In discussions about education, using inclusive language like students with learning differences, instead of learning disabled students, emphasizes the diversity of learning styles rather than pathologizing students. Discourse analysis would explore how this language shift reflects changing attitudes toward education and inclusion. Example 5. Gender-neutral language in legislative texts. Some countries have adopted gender-neutral language in legal documents, replacing he or she with they or the individual. Discourse analysis would explore how this linguistic change reflects efforts to create more inclusive legal systems that recognize non-binary individuals. Challenges in analyzing inclusive language through discourse. 1. Resistance to change. While inclusive language is increasingly accepted in many areas, it often meets resistance from those who view it as politically correct or unnecessary. Discourse analysts must consider how inclusive language is contested and how power dynamics shape its adoption or rejection. 2. Tokenism versus genuine inclusion. Inclusive language can sometimes be used symbolically without leading to real social change, creating a gap between discourse and action. Discourse analysts must critically examine whether inclusive language reflects genuine inclusivity or functions as a form of tokenism or performative allyship. 3. Cultural and contextual variability. Inclusive language varies across cultures and contexts, making it important to consider how different communities define and engage with inclusivity. Discourse analysts must be sensitive to how inclusive language is interpreted and adapted in diverse settings. Conclusion. Inclusive language plays a critical role in promoting social justice, equality, and respect for diversity. Through discourse analysis, researchers can explore how language shapes social identities, challenges discrimination, and reflects power dynamics. By examining gender-neutral language, person-first terms, racial representations, and efforts to address bias, discourse analysis reveals how inclusive language can foster more equitable and respectful communication. Understanding how inclusive language is used and contested in different contexts is essential for creating more just and inclusive societies. Frequently asked questions. What is inclusive language, and why is it important in discourse analysis? Inclusive language refers to the deliberate use of words that avoid excluding or marginalizing individuals or groups based on gender, race, disability, or other characteristics. In discourse analysis, studying inclusive language helps reveal how linguistic choices promote equality, challenge stereotypes, and reflect power dynamics in society. How does discourse analysis examine gender-neutral and non-binary language? Discourse analysis investigates how language shifts, like using they, them, pronouns or terms like chairperson, reflect broader changes in recognizing gender diversity and resisting traditional gender norms. It explores how these changes shape social relations and inclusivity. What role does inclusive language play in avoiding racial and ethnic stereotypes? Inclusive language helps prevent reinforcing harmful stereotypes. For instance, shifting from illegal immigrant to undocumented immigrant avoids dehumanization. Discourse analysis looks at how such changes affect public perceptions and contribute to more humane, respectful discussions. What is person-first language, and how is it analyzed? Person-first language, like saying, person with a disability, instead of disabled person, emphasizes the individual rather than defining them by a condition. Discourse analysis examines how this language promotes dignity and challenges stereotypes about people with disabilities. How does inclusive language ensure fair representation of marginalized groups? Discourse analysis studies how inclusive terms, such as indigenous peoples, rather than tribes, amplify the visibility and respect of marginalized groups. It explores how these language choices reflect social progress toward acknowledging diversity and historical contexts. What strategies do discourse analysts use to study inclusive language? Critical discourse analysis, CDA, explores how language reflects power dynamics and promotes or challenges systems of oppression. Frame analysis looks at how inclusive or exclusive language frames social issues. Rhetorical analysis examines how language persuades audiences toward inclusivity. Pragmatic analysis studies how language functions in specific social interactions to promote inclusivity. Can inclusive language face resistance? Yes, inclusive language can meet resistance from those who view it as excessive or unnecessary. Discourse analysis investigates how such resistance is framed and what power dynamics underlie debates over inclusive language use. How does inclusive language address implicit bias and microaggressions? Inclusive language helps avoid subtle forms of discrimination, such as microaggressions. For example, asking, "Where are you really from?" implies exclusion. Discourse analysis explores how awareness and shifts in language help reduce such biases and promote inclusivity. What are examples of inclusive language in practice? Examples include corporate statements like, "We value diversity," media using "partner" instead of gendered terms, and political discourse adopting "undocumented" over "illegal." Discourse analysis examines whether these shifts signify genuine inclusivity or are performative. What are the challenges in analyzing inclusive language through discourse analysis? Challenges include distinguishing genuine inclusivity from tokenism, navigating resistance to inclusive practices, and accounting for cultural differences in language use. Discourse analysts must critically assess how inclusive language is interpreted across different contexts.